Thanks very much to the South Georgia Association for inviting me to give this talk this evening. Right, so my name's John Dickens, and I have spent about 2.5 years on South Georgia. And I'll be talking to you a little bit about some of the work that we did last year at just around South Georgia, using drones to conduct all of these aerial surveys. But I first need to go back a few years. So I wouldn't be talking to you this evening if it wasn't for a TED Talk that I watched in 2013. So TED Talks are short, educational, informational talks on a huge variety of subjects. There's thousands of these things. But this one that I watched was all about using drones for conservation and all of the different aspects that these tools would be used for in the future. So 7 years ago, they were still quite novel devices. They were quite expensive. Most of them were pretty large, and they were quite unreliable. There's loads of videos online of drone pilots sprinting down the beach, chasing after their drone that's disappearing over the horizon. But thankfully, things have improved a lot since then. And we're now sitting with these drones that are much smaller than they used to be. There are still a lot of big drones out there, but a lot of them have become a lot more compact. The price of these things has dropped tremendously. And most importantly, they're also a lot more reliable. So this talk that I watched, it stuck in the back of my mind. And a few years later, I was introduced to the sub-Antarctic. And my first island that I went to was Prion Island, which is one of the Prince Edward Islands. So if any of you picked up a bit of an accent, if you guessed South Africa, 10 points. So I went to Prion primarily to grow a beard, but I also did a little bit of work with seals and killer whales as well. And it was on Prion Island that I met all of these amazing animals that would become such a big part of my life over the next few years. And this drone idea, this is where all of this drone work started to develop. And we did a huge amount of work with elephant seals. And we were working so close to these animals that there was quite a bit of disturbance to them. And there was also the safety aspect of the researchers themselves. One of the other guys who was working with me was bitten twice by elephant seals during that year. Neither bite was bad, but still, if we're working in such close proximity, there must be a better way to do it. The other side of things was looking at the efficiency and the environmental impact that we were having. So the birders would go out and work with the wandering albatross. Prion has a very big population of wanderers. And they would take hours going from nest to nest, checking to see if the birds were there. And while they tried to limit the amount of walking that they did to form paths in between these nests, it was inevitable that if you're going past these nests day after day, eventually you'd wear a pretty big path in. So if we could fly a drone up, fly it over, take some photographs to see if the birds are there, it could save a huge amount of time, and it would save a lot of environmental impact as well. And the third side of things, which was quite a big one, was looking at the accuracy. So Prion has these huge colonies of macaroni penguins, hundreds of thousands. And watching some of the bird researchers go in and count a known area, count exactly how many birds are in that, and then just extrapolate. The best you can do is get a rough estimate of how many birds are there. And there were a few cliffs close to some of these colonies. And as soon as you got some height and you were looking down on them, as you can see in the picture on the bottom right here, everything just opens up quite a lot. And there's a lot more order that you can just start seeing individuals rather than just this mass of birds from a low oblique angle. So that all started developing in the back of my mind, and I had this project in my head. So I returned to South Africa, and I was there for a few months, and then I decided, right, time to head back south again. And I spent 18 months on Bird Island, and it was my first time spending any time on South Georgia. And for those of you who know the islands, you'll know how rare a picture like this is up on that northwestern tip. Blue skies, sun. I think we had about 10 days like that over the course of the 18 months, but it was absolutely incredible. I was working with seals while I was there, and while it wasn't drone work, we were still elevated above the colonies. The researchers were safe from the seals. The seals were less disturbed to a point regarding the amount of work that we did on these animals than they would have been had we been walking through them day in and out. And once again, from that top-down view, all of these animals just became a lot clearer. Pups couldn't hide behind their mothers. The females couldn't hide behind the bulls. So you could just get a really nice, accurate view of what was going on the beach. For those of you not familiar with the Bird Island work, that's paint that we use to mark individuals so that we know who's who. So I returned for 6 months or so back to the real world, and it wasn't long before I finally managed to get another job. And this time I headed down to King Edward Point. But during my 6 months back in South Africa, I bought a little drone. So if my camera is still working, I went out and I bought a very small drone. It's tiny, but I racked up about 50 hours worth of flying time on that, taking videos of whales and dolphins and all sorts of things off the coast of South Africa. And when I started working at BAS again for the second time around, I proposed this idea of using drones for wildlife surveys. And there were a few people who were kind enough to listen to me drone on about these surveys that we could do. And I went for a few lessons, got my pilot's qualifications, and BAS supplied a drone, and down we went. So this is a view of King Edward Point and King Edward Cove that you would usually require a helicopter to see, or maybe if you were flying one of the Hercules from the Falkland Islands, you might be lucky enough to get a view like that. But this was taken with a little drone, a little bit bigger than my own personal one. So that's the drone that we took down. It's called it's a quadcopter type. It's got 4 arms, it's got 4 rotors. That's the camera unit at the bottom there. This is the remote control over here. And you just plug your cell phone in, you run the correct app, and off it goes. So it's a DJI, which is the company Mavic Pro 2. And it's an amazing little tool. That camera is stabilized, so you get this very, very stable footage from this drone. And it can fly at speeds of about 72 kilometers an hour, which is pretty fast for such a small little thing. And it can fly quite high and fly quite far, a few kilometers away. So an amazing little device, and small enough that you can just shove it in a backpack, which is incredible. So the main objective of going down and taking this drone with was to go and survey the elephant seals at St. Andrews Bay. So in October, during the last week of October, is the peak pupping date for the elephant seals. And we know that from previous records. And this is the time when the majority of females, the majority of cows are out on the beach to give birth and suckle their pups. And typically trying to conduct a ground count of that many seals, when you've got thousands of seals all in front of each other, on top of each other, it would be very, very difficult to conduct a ground count. And there would be a huge amount of disturbance. You've got enormous king penguin colonies up at the back. You've got all of these seals on the beach. So there would be disturbance. It would be dangerous for the researchers to try and find their way along the beach somehow to count all of these animals. And to get an accurate count from the ground would be just very, very difficult. So things look a little bit different once you are up in the air. And that's a picture from one of the drone images. You've got king penguins up at the back. So these are this brown patch up at the back there. Hopefully this is as clear on your monitors as it is on mine. Those are king penguin chicks. These are king penguin adults. And you've got all of these elephant seals on the front here. So just to give you an overview of how this is done, basically you just fly the drone up into the air and you fly along a set path, taking photographs every couple of seconds. So you set the camera so that it's pointing straight down. And the objective is to get enough overlap between images that you are taking so that software can then stitch these things together. So it's basically like any aerial survey that's been done in the past from planes or from helicopters, but we're just using a drone to go and do it. So you fly the drone at a set speed along the beach, and it takes multiple photos all the way along. And you end up with this area of images that you've captured. Now, if you've got a much bigger area, you can fly transects. and just fly basically back and forth over this area, just ensuring that you've got enough overlap between images so that you can stitch them all together. The drone returns to its takeoff point and hopefully lands safely, well away from all of these animals. So the researcher or the pilot is nice and safe. The animals are undisturbed if the drone is flown at a reasonable height so that they can't hear it. And this is an example from the St. Andrews Bay survey. So hopefully this will play quite, it'll be a bit jerky, but these are all of the images that are taken one after the other. And it might not look it from this slideshow, but there's enough overlap between each of those images that we can then stitch them all together. And it forms basically one big panoramic image of the entire beach. So from this height, you can already start to make out there's some bulls, there's cows, there's pups. And what you end up with, once you've stitched all of those images together, is a full orthomosaic image, which looks a little bit like that. So from this height, you can't really get very much definition from this image. But if we zoom in a little bit, so that image is made up of about probably 150 photographs, individual stills. So we can zoom into that section, and you can see this is a big channel that flows out from the glaciers, which dissects the beach. And this would have been impossible for us to get across if we were conducting a ground survey. It would have been completely impossible for us to get to the second half of the beach unless we had a boat to get round. So if we zoom in a bit more, now you can really start to get a bit more detail and start making out the animals. But we can zoom in even more and get a higher resolution. And now you can clearly see all of the individual seals on that beach. We can zoom in even further to give you a clearer overview. So we can now go ahead and start counting every animal that's on that beach. I won't go through this process counting all 6,000 and something cows, but by using a different version of, or a different type of software, we can draw dots on every one of those animals and break it up into the different classes. So the nice thing with elephant seals is that the bulls are so much larger than the cows, and the pups are really distinguishable from the cows and everything else as well. So by doing that across that entire coastline manually takes quite a long time, but you get a very, very accurate idea of exactly how many animals are on that beach. In the future, it looks like there'll be software that will be able to do this, artificial intelligence software that will automatically recognize the individual seals, and it should be able to distinguish between the males and females and pups as well. So that's the full count of St. Andrews Bay, which is the first time that that's been done in 24 years. We've got a full count of all of the cows, bulls, and pups. And we managed to do that on the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, and 25th of October. So 4 full days of flying all the way along this beach. It took very little time to do these flights. It took much longer to do the counting on the computer, but it's a highly accurate count, and it's something that hasn't been done for this area before. And by doing flights on subsequent days, we worked out that the peak pupping date was about the 25th of October. There were far fewer females arriving between the 24th and 25th than there were between the 2 previous days. So it's an amazing opportunity to get to do this count. And we managed to do the same thing at Hound Bay on the way back to King Edward Point from St. Andrews Bay. The weather was just unbelievable. We had this weather window of about 4 days where we could go out and do the survey, and we had glassy, calm seas all the way over to St. Andrews and back again. So it was really, really lucky to have that weather window. Around King Edward Cove as well, I also managed to do a lot of flights. I conducted about 50 surveys over the course of the season along this coastline, and doing exactly the same thing, flying the drone along the coast, taking images, and then stitching all of those together. And if we zoom into this section, that red rectangle there, that's King Edward Point. We can zoom in further, and you can see all of the elephant seals on the beach. So it's an amazing way to get a really accurate count of all of these animals. And we can do the same thing for fur seals. So this was my Vicken in December. And fur seals are great as well. The bulls are bigger than the cows, and the pups, these little black pups, are very, very distinguishable. So we can get a full count of exactly how many fur seals are along the coast. Thanks to the South Georgia government, we were also able, or I was also able to head down to look at these lovely beasts. So there's a small population of Weddell seals that pup in Larsen Harbor and Drygalski Fjord at the bottom of South Georgia. They're on a few other beaches there as well. So this is Larsen Harbor, and the Weddells are well known to pup on Bonner Beach and Laws Beach, which are the two beaches on either side of the bay. And there've been 1 or 2 records of seals on the back at the ice at the back of the bay. But using the drone, I could fly over, and it's the first records that we've got of cows with their pups, and even a hole in the ice, a breathing hole in the ice, that we could record at the back of Larsen Harbor. So it opened up a completely new area that we just wouldn't have been able to look at before. And it's not limited to seals. We can do the same thing with gentoos. So these were Gentoo penguins at Maiviken, and flown at a reasonable height, you can count every bird that's on its nest and get a really accurate count of how many birds are there without disturbing them by flying at a reasonable height. And we were also able to go to the Bay of Isles. So this is the Pharos, the fisheries patrol vessel. And the Bay of Isles is interesting because it's got it's got a fairly large population of wandering albatross that nest on these islands. And they surveyed fairly infrequently. Albatross Island is surveyed about once a year. Prion Island is surveyed about 3 or 4 times a year. But the other islands, we don't go to them very often. They are very isolated to get to. You have to have the ship to go in and then go ashore by rib, by one of the smaller vessel. And one of the biggest issues that we have is the potential of introducing invasive species. So as I'm sure lots of you are aware, there's been a huge amount of money put into getting rid of the rodents, getting rid of the reindeer. And I'm not suggesting that we would take reindeer onto these islands with us, but there would be a good chance of accidentally introducing plants, invasive plants. If there were seeds caught on any Velcro or anything, that would be a huge problem. So by flying over these islands using a drone, we can do a full aerial survey of all of them. I managed to do all of the islands that have historically had wandering albatross on them in the past over the course of about 4 hours in one morning, flying from the back of the Pharos. So the Pharos would go close to one of the islands, we'd launch the drone and fly back and forth, collecting loads and loads of images. And if the battery was getting low, I would fly back to the Pharos, we'd change the battery out and then fly back to the point that we left off on and carry on. So to be able to get full high detailed aerial maps of these islands over the course of a morning without having to have a helicopter sit down at South Georgia over the course of the season or fly a plane specially over to try and get this sort of footage, it's absolutely amazing. So we can zoom into Prion Island to get a bit of a closer look. So Prion has a boardwalk on it, and using the drone, you've got the potential to go and see if any work needs done on the boardwalk, if it needs repairs. So tourists go ashore here and they can go and see the wanderers from this boardwalk. There's a fur seal lying over there, which you might be able to see on your image. But the main reason for flying over for us was to go and look for wandering albatross. So here you can see this is a wandering albatross nest. They produce these sort of cup-shaped nests on the ground. It was quite late in the season, so the wandering albatross chicks had already started wandering around. They tend to stretch their legs and go for a bit of a walk when they're old enough. So that's a wandering albatross chick over there, and that's an adult over there. So looking down at this bottom section of the island, we can see the same sort of thing. So there's a nest and there's a chick. So it's a very beneficial tool to go and be able to survey all of these islands, get an estimate of or to get a count of the number of birds that are still on them. And we also had an amazing whale season. we had a huge number of humpback whales come down during the 2019 summer season, 2019-2020 season. And I particularly like this image because we've got Grytviken in the background where all of the whaling took place. We've got Discovery House over here where so much of the research took place that fed into, led onto the moratorium on whaling. And we've got humpbacks returning into the bay for, it's one of the first times they've been so close to King Edward Point since the whaling years. So I really like that image. It's just this nice circle of how everything's been going there. And undoubtedly one of my best sightings, I was over at Maiviken doing some research on the giant petrels. I looked out to sea and there was this massive spout, and I put the drone in the air and up surfaced a blue whale. And I think it's also one of the first times a blue has been seen so close to island. Anybody who's been following the BBC News recently will have seen all of the news, Jen Jackson and the rest of the whaling team's news on blue whales on South Georgia. So I was just so happy to capture that footage because I don't think anybody would have believed me had I come back to base and said, oh, I just saw a blue whale over at Maiviken. So that was some of the wildlife work that we were doing. And it extends, the drone work extends well beyond that. I mean, these were a few flights that I did in around the whaling stations in Stromness. This was looking at a few of the whaling stations for the government. The builders were interested to see what sort of condition the whaling stations were in, and done in exactly the same way, flying back and forth across these big areas, covering as much land as possible, and capturing a few single images as well of the whaling station. So this is Husvik, looking rather run down. You can see the streams have been flowing through the station and some of these buildings have just collapsed completely. There's Stromness from a very different angle. And Grytviken, which is easy enough to fly around, being so close at King Edward Point. And I believe we'll be hearing a little bit about these here quite soon. So those are some of the whaling station bits and pieces. And I'd like to just finish off by showing a few short videos. This works best if I have some audio playing in the background. So hopefully this won't break any copyright infringements or anything, but here's a little bit of audio and some beautiful South Georgia videos to finish off the talk on. Is that working? Technical difficulties. Let's see if this works now. Don't think I'm going to win with sound.
Amazing.
Great, and I think that's it. We finish off on the St. Andrews Bay sunrise.
That's brilliant, John. Thank you very much for that. I think everyone found that very enjoyable. I did have some problems with my internet. I got cut out for a little bit in the middle, but hopefully it was okay for everybody else. Are there any questions for John? I mean, there's lots of very positive comments coming up on the chat. Somebody even asked you to sing a song, John, to accompany the video, but that's Jerome asked that. Also, someone wanted just confirmation of the model of drone you were using.
So it was a DJI Mavic 2 Pro. I can go back to that slide just to show you it again.
And also a question about the height you were flying at to avoid disturbance, John. That was the other one.
Yeah. Right, let's go out of that. So I think we'll head back into that. Right, we'll start off with the model of drone. So it's a DJI Mavic 2 Pro, which looks a bit like that. So it's just a regular drone. You can buy them from most decent camera shops and just online. The learning curve is really easy. It's quite easy to learn how to fly them. And yeah, there's a lot of redundancy and a lot of backups in place to ensure that they are as safe as possible. So what I didn't mention was that they're fully connected to, they've got lots of GPS sensors and things inside them. So they're connected to loads of satellites. As you fly along, every single picture that's taken has this georeference point attached to it. So it knows exactly where all of these photos are taken. So when you are stitching everything together, that image is already georeferenced. So you can then just drag that into a GIS program, and it automatically lines up with everything. So they're amazing little devices. And regarding the height that I was flying at, it depended on the surveys that I was doing. So something like that would be about 100 meters. There was absolutely no disturbance with the LEs. Well, I mean, if anybody spent any time on a beach that's covered in elephant seals, you'll know how loud it is. They make a huge noise, and you've got thousands of kings at the back as well, which are all making a noise. You've got the noise of the sea as well. So there's so much external noise that the sound of the drone is really drowned out. But for some of these lower aerial shots, for this complete stitch that I did, that was at about 60 meters, and that was high enough that we could get high enough resolution to see every individual animal on the beach. In the Bay of Isles, I had to fly a little bit higher. Some of the islands, particularly Albatross Island, it's about 80 meters above sea level. So I had to ensure that I was flying at a height suitable enough that I would have enough distance between the top of the island and the height of the drone. And there is software that you can use that follows the topography of the land. But all of these flights that I made here were all manually flown. And it would be very difficult to judge the height that you're flying at if you were doing that manually. The restriction in that airspace, you can get permission to fly above it, but we were restricted to about 120 meters. So most of the flights were between sort of 40 and 120 meters.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, John. There are a few more questions for you in the chat, but just for the benefit of time, I suggest we'll move on. If you could have a look in the chat and answer a few of the questions that have come through to you, John. Also some really positive feedback on your talk, which I'm sure you'll be happy to read and see anyway. And your tea towels falling down, but apart from that, all went very well. Well, brilliant. Thank you very much, John. That was excellent. And I'm sure everybody really enjoyed seeing South Georgia from a different perspective.